So back in sort of the later stages of the COVID-19 lockdowns, I was an Ian O'Harwood artist at the time, and we did a Wigmore recital. It was sort of split into three different recitals, and Ian Burnside was curating and playing. So I sort of got to know, we did a couple of those things with Ian. So that's how I got to know Ian. And there was this Italian themed recital, which is the one I was in. So we did some of the Wolf songs, everything was in translation. So some of the Wolf Italian songs in translation. I did some of the Han, Venezia, the Venetian songs in translation. And then we did 4 of Britten's Michelangelo sonnets. So that was the first time I sort of had sung any of them. So I'd never done them in Italian. And then, so I loved them. I really, really loved them. And it was actually Ian who said, not with any, I don't think, not with any agenda as such, but he just said, wouldn't it be amazing if we could just record all of these? Because these translations are incredible. And of course, that was Jeremy Sams. So when I first sat down with Ian to discuss what kind of album we were going to make and what repertoire should be on it, the first thing I said was, I really want to do those translations of the Michelangelo sonnets. So we had 4 of them. So I just sent Jeremy an email and commissioned the other 3. So that's how that all came about.
I know, you know, my lord, I know you know the longing that I feel when I am near you. I know, you know, how I worship and revere you. Why are we weary when we say hello?
Is there a window into how they would have felt at the time, and that history of, because I think we quite often, because I knew that being gay or queer was illegal at that time. I know that, but I don't think I've ever really stopped to think about that and how that would have affected all of the lives of the people that belonged to that community. And I just thought it was kind of crazy. Of course, in my education, there was no mention of any of this. You know, there was just nothing. So when I was doing my research into all of this, I was just, you know, and reading some of Britten's the letters between the two of them. It's just so completely heartbreaking that they were so madly in love. And I always thought of them, you know, like, because when I was at college, you know, we would see those, you know, those black and white videos of Piers singing "Oh Waly Waly" and Britten at the piano. And it all seems so sort of polite and serious and quite straight-laced, excuse the pun. But, you know, it's that kind of, like, we couldn't quite reach them. And actually, they were just nothing like that. You know, the way they spoke to each other, at least in letters, you know, these really like funny and adorable terms of endearment they had for each other. So I just really wanted to show that. And there's these songs, yeah, as you say, especially number 4, just lets you into actually how painful it could be to be right next to the person that you love, but completely unable to acknowledge it in front of anybody else. So the translations are fab. And, you know, I've been told one of the first letters Piers received after Britten's death was from the Queen. So it's just like, people knew, but weren't allowed to even, you know, say that they knew in that way. It was just, it's just really, really sad. But they, at least they did get to live, you know, most of their lives together. And, you know, it's that terrible thing of, if it hadn't have been that way, would we have had the music that we do have now? Which is sort of a terrible thing to say, but it's, you know, it's sort of there in the background.
Sing a swan of sixpence, a broken-hearted guy, 24 whoopers kept locked up inside. When the door was opened, the swans began to hiss. What is the solution for such a man as this?
Balancing, curating this album was a real balancing act from the beginning. Once we'd chosen the sonnets, and they're, you know, cerebral and quite dark. I mean, the last two are really, you know, joyful and, you know, there's huge outpourings of love. So I knew I needed to balance the whole thing out. And so I said to Ian, well, actually, Ian said to me first, because he knew I sort of dabbled in composition. And he said, have you thought about doing your own songs? And I said, yes, I have. But for obvious reasons, I've been very, very nervous about doing so, because I knew if I did, they would need to, I would never want to be so presumptuous as to say, oh, they're as good as the Britain. I mean, but I knew they had to stand alongside these other cycles and be their own thing and sort of hold their own in that sense. So I contacted Andrew Macmillan, who's just amazing queer poet based in Manchester, and so and said, because I've read quite a bit of his stuff, and I asked him, you know, do you have anything that you had imagined would be set to music? And so he pointed me in the direction of this sequence of 8 poems that he wrote called Swan. And I thought, okay, that's nice and vague. So, you know, I ordered the collection and read through them. In the back, it says that Andrew wrote them after he saw a performance of Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake. I thought, okay, so this is really interesting, because I mean, not only is Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake a sort of queer retelling of that same story with some contemporary ballet, but also, of course, it's Tchaikovsky. So I thought, okay, so this massively, massively fits in to, but I thought they're going to match the Britain quite well. And there are a few moments in Swan where I wouldn't say I've quoted Britain, but the ending of the first song and the ending of the final song are similar, shall we say. They've got the same sort of motify thing going on. So and it was very deliberate, because I wanted, because these are the 2 cycles that bookend the album. So I really wanted it to feel like this complete thing. But also, of course, it let me really be quite cheeky and include, you know, some less than subtle quotes from Tchaikovsky. There's just one song which is, I mean, it doesn't need pointing out, because as soon as you get to it, you'll be like, okay. But I think it wasn't just, oh, I have to get this in there. It just so happened that it really, really works with that particular poem. So yeah, and so it's a more contemporary queer story, and there is this feeling at the end of that cycle of a sort of an acceptance, or a coming to terms with that sort. Yeah, so I kind of think that balances, I do think that balances quite nicely with the Britain.
Oh, land of fear, where we grew to manhood, you and I, Patroclus.
With the Tippet, I first sung the songs for Achilles at the Ludlow English Song Weekend. Again, curated by Ian Burnside. And I just sort of fell in love with them. They're really, really hard. They're really hard songs. It's getting one's ear used to singing with guitar as opposed to piano is really tough, because as soon as I start singing, I basically lose maybe not I don't lose the sort of harmonic world. I can still hear the notes, but the pulse just completely disappears. So technically they're really, really tricky, not to mention just musically. I mean, the pitching and the jumps, and they're really, really, really tough. So I thought, actually, if I've done them live, doing them in a recording will be more than possible, because of course you can have another go if it doesn't go right. And I was just so lucky that Craig Ogden agreed to play, because he's just amazing. And he just made the whole thing so easy. But I've read, a few years ago, I read Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles, which is this sort of adolescent coming of age of Achilles and Patroclus. And, you know, in a completely unambiguous, and it is a completely queer love story, and this sort of discovery for both of these young men. And I just thought it was so beautifully written, and I absolutely just fell in love with this book. And it was after that I did the Songs for Achilles in Ludlow. And I thought, okay, so these are, and I didn't know that they existed before. I've never seen King Priam, so I didn't know that these songs were in existence until they were given to me. And so I just loved the theme of them. I loved the way Tippett had written it, because in one sense, I think they're very explicit. You know, like, shall we kiss after the war? You know, it doesn't, I feel like it makes it quite clear. And the final song is just, you know, this grief that Achilles is feeling, because Patroclus has gone out in his place wearing his armor and has been killed. And it's just, you know, this just real sense of grief and agony. And you can't help but feel, when you read things about Tippett, that he's in there, that because he is someone, you know, clearly someone who struggled a lot with it, eventually came to terms with it. And of course, in the Knot Garden, there are, you know, gay characters. And I feel like there weren't many operas around at that time that would be bold enough to do that unambiguously. So I think Tippett really knew what he was doing. And I don't think he's been so cagey with his text, because that's the amazing thing, is it's rare you get to sing music where the music and the text is by the composer. So I don't think he was being so restrained in his writing that he would think people wouldn't understand. But I still do think people could listen to them quite easily and just go, oh, he's sad for his friend. You know, I still do think that that's out there for whatever reason. And I thought my presenting these songs within the context of this album would really just make extra clear, in case we needed to do that, that this is what these songs are. You know, and I think I'm brave enough to say that it's not a matter of opinion. It's that is, we're dealing with, you know, a queer cycle for tenor voice and guitar. And yeah, and they're amazing.
Because God put his adamantine fate between my sullen heart and its desire.
I was very keen to find a composer who was a contemporary, more or less, of Britten and Tippett, but who had been sort of sidelined, overlooked, or possibly even ignored more deliberately. And I thought, well, the most likely candidate for that kind of treatment is gonna be a woman composer. It's just, that's, you know, it's so sad that that's the way it was. And so I went scrolling through Google, and I think I eventually typed in something like British women composers or something like that. Because I was, at one stage, I was going to do some Dilys Elwyn Edwards or some Grace Williams, because, well, I thought maybe I'll sing in Welsh, and it would be nice to include some of that. But I've done a lot of Welsh recordings, and I want to do a lot more, and nothing quite fit. So I kept on going, and I got to G, and I saw Ruth Gipps's name, and I thought, I've never heard of Ruth Gipps. Most of the others, I'd say I sort of, I'd heard of, still not, anywhere near as widely performed as they should be, but I found Ruth Gipps's name. So I clicked on it, and then I read a bit about her, and I thought, okay, that's interesting. Went down to her works, and then it said 1940. Okay, I was like, the year the sonnets were written. And then it said 4 songs of youth for tenor voice, with poems by Rupert Brooke. And I was like, okay. So I thought, I have to find these songs. I mean, I had, absolutely no recordings in existence, either live or studio. I mean, absolutely nothing. Could not find any publication of these songs, could find no trace of their existence other than this one thing on Wikipedia. That's all I could find. So I put it on Facebook, and I just said, does anyone happen to have any way of accessing Ruth Gipps's music library? Anyway, a conductor colleague of mine did. He's conducted some of her symphonies with his orchestra. So I thought, okay, well, great. Made the contact, was sent the songs the same day via PDF, all in her own handwriting, very neatly written, sort of very, very clear. And the poems were perfect, perfect. The first one, because God has put his adamantine fate between my sullen heart and its desires. And I thought, okay, thank you, Rupert Brooke. And then, of course, I can play the piano, but these songs are really, really tricky. And she was 19 when she wrote them. So really, really young, which kind of had me thinking, oh, is that why they're called Songs of Youth? Or is it because Rupert Brooke, of course, I mean, he died when he was 26, 27, one or the other. So they were both really young. So I thought maybe that's why they're called this, as well as the sort of themes that appear in the songs, of course. And they're just absolutely amazing. I actually inputted them into Sibelius so that I could click play, so that I could hear them, back. I mean, obviously in this horrible MIDI sound, but at least I got a sense of the harmony, because at the pace I was able to play them, I was getting no sense of what they would be like. And they're just completely beautiful. The final song particularly, it's just gorgeous. And yeah, I just felt like these songs deserve to be heard, and they deserve to be part of a more regular part of this repertoire. And yeah, I would have been the first person to ever record her songs, I think, but Roddy Williams beat me to it. So, which is obviously amazing, because, the more of her music we hear, the better it is. And Roddy's recording is completely, completely gorgeous and orchestrated for the Halle. So really, really, really beautiful thing that he did. But these songs are, I'm so excited for people to hear them, because I just think, it's almost like they're a world premiere. They're not quite, because we did find out there was a BBC broadcast from Birmingham in 1952. And I think it was Ronald Bristol, the tenor. But even in the program, the specific names of the songs aren't listed. It just says, items by Ruth Gipps or something like that. So it's still not hardcore evidence. And this broadcast must be in an archive somewhere. It must be. But we've made efforts to find them and have not succeeded. So if anybody out there is, sees this and is like, I know where it is, it'd be fascinating to hear them. But yeah. everything about the album just sort of came together. And the Rupert Brooke being on there, I think, is actually quite important, because we know sort of a lot about his life. Apart from that, his life was incredibly short. You know, I bought this, you know, this biography, and I thought, okay, so he was only 20, 26, 27 when he died, so it's not going to be long. And it's like, you know, it's dense. So there's so much that he accomplished in such a short space of time. And then actually the Rupert Brooke also being clearly from our point of view, very bisexual. That might not be the best label for him, but it's sort of the only one that we know enough about to sort of use, if that makes any sense. So in that sense, it also really fit in. And it led also to why I included To Gratiana Dancing and Singing by W. Dennis Brown, because we needed actually something in the middle of the album that was a standalone piece that felt a little bit like just a sort of 4-minute song where people could just go, oh, okay. You know, I sort of know this one a little. I mean, it's still not widely performed, but it also, because it's very difficult for the pianist. He's written in this really kind of cool, all these crossovers. So, but it's such a beautiful song, and I had heard it before, and I thought it'd be really good if we can get this on there. And it just gives the listeners that little bit of time where they can just go, okay, this is a little bit more familiar, and I can just let the whole thing just sort of wash over me. But then, of course, talking to Ian, him being the sort of fountain of knowledge that he is, I had no idea that, you know, they were best friends, completely best friends, went to rugby school together, Cambridge together, went to the war together, and W. Dennis Brown literally buried Brooke on this Greek island. And it was I'd found the whole thing just really moving, this sort of friendship that they had. And, you know, there is a sort of a general consensus that there may have been some form of unrequited love there, from that W. Dennis Brown was actually in love with Brooke, because this is beautiful story, and Ian tells it so much better than I do. But the sort of general gist is, when they were at Cambridge, they would put on these, you know, plays or some sort of variety show or whatever. I'm not quite sure what it was, but W. Dennis Brown would be the music director, and Brooke did this dance in one of these shows to this lovely sort of bit of music. And of course, many years later, what we get is that same bit of music arranged by W. Dennis Brown using this poem by Lovelace, and that's To Gratiana Dancing and Singing. So there's this, you know, this general consensus that the song is about Brooke. So of course, from whoever is singing the song is singing about this woman dancing and being so entrancing and drawing everyone in. And but I just love the idea that, although it's not explicit, even when I was singing it, I was like, I'm glad I know that story, because it just made it a little bit more spicy somehow, something I could grab hold of even more strongly. But it's just such a beautiful song. I'm glad that we had the time allowance to get it in there, because it's gorgeous. So I've never played an explicitly open queer character on stage. I have done 5 Britain roles. Of those 5, I would say in Paul Bunyan, so there's Inkslinger, who is, the libretto is by Auden. So, and Inkslinger is really a sort of cipher for Auden. So, you know, you don't have to read between the lines too much to think, okay, so Inkslinger is probably a queer character, but it's still not explicit. Of course, it never would have been, because Britain wrote it when they were out living in America during the Second World War. So it's, it would have been overtly out there, but you can play it in a certain way. But I still don't think that counts. There's, Quint in Turn of the Screw, but that's such an eternally complicated character, and not to mention that he's actually not even alive. So again, like, you can sort of put things in there, especially if you have a director who wants to lean into that. But again, it's not explicit. In fact, it's completely ambiguous. And then you have you have characters like Grimes. I mean, I've not played Grimes, of course, but you have characters like Grimes and Captain Veer, and they're there. But again, it's still not, until we get to Death in Venice, which, hopefully one day, but not quite yet. But the answer is no. I've played a queer character once, and this was after we sort of conceived the album, and it was for a family, one of those family days at the Royal Opera House, and it was a Pride themed thing. So this new little two-hander play was commissioned, and I played Piers and the pianist played Britain, and it was a sort of 25-minute almost monologue. Almost. There was a little bit of dialogue between the two of us, and we sort of interjected. There was some of Britain's. I think there was a cabaret song in there, one of the sonnets, a Whaley Whaley, and there was Schubert in there as well. But that's the first time I've actually been on stage talking, speaking or singing lines explicitly about another man. And I do think, part of the reason I did this was because I have no problem with being on a stage and acting like a straight man. That's what a lot of these operas are. Most, 100% more or less of the roles I've done are like that. And I'm not saying that needs to change, but it's more about adding other things in, I think. And it's about writing new operas, which is starting to happen, like the Champion opera at the Met. And I think it is starting to happen, and to get more authentic representation of marginalized or more diverse communities on an operatic stage. So, you can make Coligny and Chaunard a gay couple in Bohème. You can, but again, it wasn't the intention in the first place. So I think, it's nice to see them walking and holding hands, but I'm not sure that's enough. I'm just not sure it's enough. So I think we just need to be telling contemporary stories, and that are already in the first place diverse, if that's what you like. That's what I would just love, that opportunity to be able, ultimately, it's to be able to bring more of myself onto a stage. That's the sort of crux of it, to be able to bring things that I can't bring to, or at least not as much in other roles. So I think that's quite, that was part of the reason I wanted to do this, was just to signal that we can do this. And I think the world is, more than ready. And I don't think we need to be worried about it. Opera is one thing, but I think perhaps recitals of art song I don't even know if people outside of classical music, outside of that bubble, know it exists or know that that's a thing. Certainly people I speak to who are completely not part of this world, they're amazed that this sort of thing is going on. And I think that's really sad, because there's so much of this repertoire which is so relevant, and it doesn't have to be, I really believe it's not a world of elitism and boring, stuffy music and people taking themselves really seriously. Because I'm not, ultimately, because I'm not. I mean, I take myself seriously, but, not too much. And I think you know, because I'm launching this at Wigmore Hall on the after the album goes out on the 29th of June. And I would love to see, obviously, everyone is welcome. And you know, if the people who would usually come, great, because they're going to get hopefully something different than they used to. But it would be so nice to see other people there from different walks of life and different communities who didn't feel that this was the sort of thing that they could go to or they would feel comfortable at. And I think, you know, if we're going to do that, you have to sort of reach out with something that is specifically geared for people, towards certain people. And I hope that that's what I've made, so that it will attract listeners who haven't listened to classical art song before.